And we'll get a copy of that to share with our
Yes.
network?
Yeah,
Nice.
for sure. So Bonjour, anin tansen, kakigekwen Indigenous. My spirit name is Forever Woman, and my given name is Ashley Richard. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you all today from Treaty 1 territory, which is the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. So I live and work in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where I've been for the past 10 years. And for just over the past year, I've been working on a project for Ryerson's Diversity Institute called the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which we refer to as WEKH. So WEKH is all about creating an inclusive innovation ecosystem for all women entrepreneurs across the country. So my role in outreach and partnership development is really just making sure that Indigenous women entrepreneurs are included in this vision. So we do have a national network of regional partnerships and our MOU partners and our hub network. And I just wanted to acknowledge our MOU partners right now, Futurepreneur, the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, the Indigenous Lift Collective, and the Indigenous Innovation Initiative at Grand Challenges Canada. So this group meets on a monthly basis and really acts as we connect once a month just to make sure at a national level, we all know what's going on, working together to reduce fragmentation and repetition. And more importantly, to this meeting today, these MOU partners help to guide the discussions that we have at these quarterly meetings. So last November, some of you might remember, our theme for the quarterly meeting was Indigenous procurement, where we heard from Public Services and Procurement Canada and Indigenous women entrepreneurs and the organizations that support Indigenous women entrepreneurs were able to ask questions directly to their office. So this quarter, the theme is mainstream banking and Indigenous women's entrepreneurship. And I just want to thank Monica James, who's one of our panelists today. So Monica James has been with BDC for a really long time, and she's a really big champion of Indigenous women entrepreneurs. And she actually partnered with us not only on hosting this event, but really on curating it right from the ground up and making sure that this conversation was something that was beneficial for everyone. So miigwech to Monica. The information that was collected last year over a series of roundtables, so we brought together just over 350 participants across the country to ask Indigenous women what are the challenges and barriers they face, but not only that, what does the future of an inclusive innovation ecosystem look like from an Indigenous woman's perspective? So all of the discussions were put together in a report called Miigwech, which is Anishinaabe for Ice Bear Woman. So the Ice Bear Woman is the symbol of resiliency and respect, and it's the traditional name that was given to WEKH in a ceremony last August here in Manitoba. Elder Margaret Lavallee from Saugeen First Nation led us in a traditional pipe ceremony, and we were gifted that name. I found that it was really important to ground the work that we do at WEKH in a traditional name, because my traditional name has been really what steered me and grounded me and rooted me in my values every single day. So when I was younger, I had asked my grandmother, what does it mean? What does Forever Woman mean? And she told me, it means you're going to grow up to be a powerful woman, even more powerful than me. And when I was 4 years old and she told me that, I didn't really understand the gravity of the work that my grandma had done in the Indigenous community. I would just see her meeting with people on TV, in newspapers, and I just thought, you know, she incepted me from a really young age. I always just knew I was going to grow up to follow in her footsteps. And so since she told me that lesson, I've always been, you know, living my life to determine what does it mean to be powerful, what does it mean to be a woman, and what does it mean to be a powerful woman. I think that there's a difference between being in a position of power and being a powerful woman. I think you can't be powerful if you don't have the respect of your community and you don't live your life with humility and integrity. So these are the things that guide me, and I hope that the pillars of the Ice Bear Woman and the lessons that come with that name are what guides this inclusive innovation innovation ecosystem. So on pages 6 to 8 of the report, that's where we discuss some of the many financial barriers that Indigenous women entrepreneurs shared. The first barrier was the overall relationship with money and moving from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of abundance. Then Shannon Pestun, who's moderating the panel, and we came up with social capital, technical competencies, and supply side barriers, all related to this overarching barrier of finance. So I want to share my screen, and we curated our panel questions based on an ask to the Indigenous Lift Collective. So the Indigenous Lift Collective is a national group of Indigenous women entrepreneurs organized and led by Tiara Fraser and Vanessa L'Esperance, who are here with us today. And we just asked, if you could ask big banks a question, what would it be? And we've been curating what they've shared with us since, I think, December, when we first started talking about this. So I will show you here exactly what it was and the asks and shares that are going to guide our discussion today. So creating services and removing barriers that present supporting on-reserve businesses, understanding that many communities and businesses are affected by poor internet connectivity and they experience service and infrastructure limitations. Indigenous women said they experience high rates of being denied credit cards and loans. They would like non-secured credit cards, lower interest line of credits, increase cultural awareness training and ensuring employees aren't blind to their biases, offering more funding and grants that support Indigenous businesses, the feeling of being passed around too much and wanting a dedicated team or support person, feeling discriminated against as an Indigenous woman, wanting more meaningful investment into the innovation phase, and concerns over rising fees during a financially stressful time such as COVID. So that was what was shared with us when we were collecting all of the thoughts. And like I said, we'll be addressing a lot of these in our panel discussion later today. But I really want to get to the exciting part of our event today, where we're going to hear from 3 Indigenous women who are going to come forward and share their direct stories and experiences with mainstream banking. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Tiara Fraser.
Tansi Kiwel, hello to all of you. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to share a few different experiences that I've had in mainstream banking and some of my thoughts, of course, about that. So I'll share one experience that I had with mainstream banking in my first venture. And I think this is the ticket, is how it ought to be. We had, when we started the first venture of my first entrepreneurial journey, we went to the bank, and the banker there, people talked about having a banker. I was like, what does even having a banker mean? And, but I understood then what it meant, because she believed in me. She believed in our business. She believed in the success that we were going to have. And that's how she showed up. And I know that she was really creative. I don't understand the banking system. I know that there's rules and there's, protocols, and I understand and I respect that. But what she did is use her knowledge in her role as a banking manager and her belief in me and the business that I was launching to find ways. Okay, well, that didn't work. Let's try this. Let's try that. And I know that she went above and beyond. And my hope for other Indigenous women entrepreneurs, specifically, it's my hope for everybody, but my hope specifically for Indigenous women entrepreneurs is that in the banking system, there are those champions that say, you know what, this is amazing. And I am right there with you. And I'm going to do everything that I can to help you succeed. And I believe that if it wasn't for this one banking manager, I would not be here. I would not be in my second venture. I would not be where I am today without her both believing in me and doing everything she could within her power, within her circle of influence to uplift me and to find ways to, okay, well, this isn't going to work, but let's apply for this. Or, okay, you need a credit card, obviously. So, there's rules. Okay, so let's do it this way, and we can find a way to work with you. And I want that. I want that for myself now, and I want that for other Indigenous women. And what I know is that when we can't access traditional financing for all the reasons, there are so many reasons. We don't even need to talk about all those reasons, although we can. But with all the barriers there, what's happening is Indigenous women aren't accessing the resources that they need in order to support their businesses. The biases in the system are egregious and visible, and we need to get those, pardon me, barriers out of the way. I'm going to speak specifically about credit cards because I'm annoyed by this right now. And this is part of why we're here in this conversation, because I'm like, WTF? Who's been to the Calgary airport? Like, show of hands, who's been to the Calgary airport? Okay, so you walk down the corridor of the Calgary airport and you are literally assaulted by probably 6 people trying to give you a credit card. All you have to do is be breathing. And I know that that's a personal credit card. I get that. All you need to do is to go to Best Buy, to Home Depot, to anywhere else. And literally, that's all you need is to be breathing to get a credit card. When it comes to our businesses, the bank says to us and me and Indigenous women entrepreneurs and everyone else, well, you need 2 years of financials before we can consider that. Yeah, okay, but I need the credit card now. Like, how am I going to pay for gas in Dease Lake for the airplane? Sure, okay, I'm going to use my personal credit card and for however long. And then, okay, so now we're at the 2-year mark of the business. Like, I needed that credit card 2 years ago. Now you're at the 2-year mark. Oh, now you don't have enough cash flow. I'm an airline startup. It takes a minute to get some cash flow. And so then you say, okay, how about, okay, so now it's based on cash flow. I say, okay, how about you give me $1,000 credit limit on a company credit card? No, sorry, can't do that. I'm like, seriously? My bank doesn't believe in my business enough to give me $1,000 unsecured credit card? No. And then they have to break a whole bunch of rules, apparently, to give me a $1,000 secured credit card. In what are we even talking about right now? This is my experience. In the Indigenous Lift Circle that I'm a part of, so I'm like, okay, it's cash flow. So they've got rules in behind there. I don't get it. So it's all about cash flow. In our Indigenous Lift Circle, we have one Indigenous woman whose business is flourishing. In the last year, her cash flow is like unbelievable. But she comes to our Lift Circle. She comes to our Lift Circle and says, now that we're in COVID, I can't buy my supplies online. Does anyone have a credit card that I can use to be able to purchase what I need for my business? The indignancy of that has me very, very feisty. So I'm like, okay, it ain't based on cash flow because she's swimming in it. So what is that about? And my point is, in my opinion, mainstream banks have to, at minimum, like if you don't believe in these businesses for $1,000 of credit card, like we have big problems. And then on top of that, access to loans. So what happens is we're now going to get, and there's some metrics being measured on this about Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples, what we're paying in interest compared to everyone else, because we're seeking and sourcing and being approved for high interest loan, which all that does is compound and reinforce the socioeconomic gaps. And so those are just a couple of my thoughts. But what I know for sure, and this is my thinking, I know for sure that my experience with that first banker is what's possible in banking. And my other suspicion is that the big banks, because I see it, I see what folks are trying to do. I see the big banks wanting to give and participate and do things differently. And I'm seeing big shifts. But how is that making it down to the people that we're talking to the people that are making those decisions? That's what I'm curious about. And I have other thoughts to share, because I've also have deep gratitude for some of the big banks who have stepped in and supported a number of the things that I'm involved in. But I want to leave it there just for the moment. Thank you.
Miigwech, Tiara, for being courageous and showing up today and sharing. I know sometimes that's not easy, so I just want to pay respect to all three of the women who are sharing today. And with that, I will introduce our next speaker, Sunshine Tenasco.
Hi, thank you for having me. I see a couple of familiar faces. Hi, Tiara. My name is Sunshine Tenasco. I'm from Kitigan Zibi, Anishinaabe, which is about an hour and a half north of Ottawa, but on the Quebec side. I have 4 children and I have a couple of projects. I started, I'm just going to give you a really quick overview so that you know where I'm coming from. Started my first business and couldn't get capital as well, and couldn't get loans, and just had a really hard time. And there were a lot of barriers. There's some organizations that do or did work with entrepreneurs, and just Indigenous entrepreneurs specifically. And in order to be able to access their services, you had to be making $50,000 a year, and you had to be committed to your project, meaning like just working on your project full time and no side gigs or whatever, which is next to impossible when you have children. And, when you look at Indigenous women and the amount of babies that we're having, and just the statistics on who we are as a people, those barriers, those rules of making $50,000 and just working on your business, you've already cut out so many Indigenous women from being able to access those services. I get the reason why those businesses are trying to help. But anyways, long story short, it didn't work for me. So as a result, I went on Dragon's Den to be able to purchase a sewing machine and a cutting press. And that was sort of the goal for that. And that opened my eyes to the possibility of, I didn't even know about investors. I didn't know what an angel investor was. It just sort of blew my mind on so many different levels. So fast forward, because that really shifted my entire life's path, I started a project called Powwow Pitch, which is a pitch competition for Indigenous entrepreneurs specifically. And basically you show up to a powwow, make your pitch, 60 seconds, get mentored for a few hours, and then come back the top 10 re-pitches. And we get to give startup cash. So before I started Powwow Pitch, I was working with Indigenous women entrepreneurs specifically at a national level. And so I had started running some conferences and workshops and things like that. And I really seen the benefit of mentorship. And what I learned there was that Indigenous women at that time, which is about 8 years ago, were starting businesses on $5,000 or less. right? And then we had all these other statistics, if they were on reserve, if they were off reserve, what they were looking for, how much money they made per year, which was substantially less. All those barriers that Tiara just mentioned, they're there across the board. And so it's just, starting a business is, number one, hard enough as it is. Couple that with everything else, and then not being able to have any capital to cash flow or nothing, you're just trying to get everything started. And so Powwow Pitch was just that, having that information. Okay, so someone out there is making a difference with $5,000. That is not a lot of money, really, to be able to become self-sufficient and then support your family and then potentially hire someone else. So Powwow Pitch started with that. We're going to give away $5,000 for the main winner, and then 1,000 whatever. So the first few years was brutal because it's just an idea. So how do you just make this idea happen? I don't know, ask people. So do you want to, give me money? I guess I'm supposed to put your logo on something. I didn't even know how that sponsorship model worked. But with that, the goal was, all you have to do is be an Indigenous entrepreneur. If you're Indigenous, you have an idea, or even if you're, 10 years into business, it's irrelevant. We want to know, what are you going to do with this money? And we want to show you, we want to help give you this money and potentially showcase what you're doing to, Cibc or whoever, just to, elevate Indigenous entrepreneurs. After a few years of doing this, and it was just at a local powwow, RBC was the first and only bank to step up and actually sponsor. Before that, we had other sponsors at a very low level, and I was doing this work for next to nothing just because I really believed in this project, and it was my other project, Her Braids, that supported me and my children. Now, obviously, we're at a better level. But the whole goal is to reach all the grassroots Indigenous entrepreneurs, and it's already a vibrant community. It's just different. So, what other people call pop-up shops, I always say this, we have that at powwows. They're called vendors, and they just use different language, but it's all the same thing. And there's a lot of, money going around, but yes, we are high risk, according to banks. So how do we become not high risk? I mean, that's the question, right? I think, investing in Indigenous entrepreneurs is the key, and investing in those grassroots ones, because, there's all this talk about scaling, which is cool. But out of all the women that I've met in all the workshops I've done, in all of the boot camps and everything, there is less than a handful who, want to own an airline, who dream that big, where they're having, you're probably moving a lot more money. Most of the women that I've had the pleasure to work with, they want to just become self-sufficient. And I'm going to, not just, because that's important, and that is more than good enough to be able to do the work that you love and support your family. So I think the idea of scaling, let's take that, just put that conversation on the side, because I don't know a lot of Indigenous businesses who are actively participating in the procurement section right now. I know that sometimes there's this little tricky thing where they have an Indigenous partner coupled with, someone else who's running. They do the 50% ownership, but it's not, it's just that's a tricky field too. And I think it's very minimal, the amount of Indigenous participation in that, compared to everybody who's actually doing business across Canada. So yeah, I mean, those are the hardships, I think, and the things that we know are the barriers. But then, the good stuff is when, RBC and BDC actively sponsor, Powwow Pitch, let's say, I'm just using that as an example, or partner with an Indigenous company that are making differences at a grassroots level. I mean, that's amazing. And I think we need more of that. so that we can help empower each other. And I'm just going to leave you with one other comment. I was giving a workshop for Invest Ottawa, and they were partnering with RBC and all that good stuff. And they had reached out to everybody they knew, every Indigenous, whatever organization, every contact they had. And they had an applicant of one person, one. And it had been weeks, but I thought it was still the draft poster and still the draft. So I didn't even know, I hadn't even promoted. And so she contacted me and said, how are we I'm kind of concerned. We only have, and I'm like, I didn't even know. I didn't even start any promotion. And I was like, don't worry about it. Like, they were worried about filling a spot for 25 people. And I just did my regular Facebook blast, LinkedIn blast, and it was all booked up in the afternoon, and they had to create a waiting list. And that just speaks volumes. And now we're going to work towards something else because they had been actively trying. And, we had a very a good conversation about this whole trust thing, right? And it's bigger than just banking, and it's bigger than just a workshop. There's this whole, reconciliation thing that has to come up in conversations, because unless it's coming from from an Indigenous organization, there's going to be a lot of mistrust. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for including me today.
Thank you so much, Sunshine. It's definitely been a pleasure watching the powwow pitch grow over the past couple years. And thank you as well for being courageous and coming today to share with all of us here. I'll introduce our third and final Indigenous woman entrepreneur who's going to share with us this afternoon / this morning, wherever you are in Canada. We have Shannon Pestun.
Thanks, Ashley. Tansei, I'm Shannon Pestun. My Anishinaabe given name is Kishipano Tenekwe, meaning tornado woman. I am Cree Métis and a woman born and raised in Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territory, along with my Cree Métis and Chipewyan family. I come from a long line of Indigenous land people of the North, and I'm honored to be here coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Dene, Nakota, Dakota, the Cree, and the homeland of the Métis. Saskatoon, a place I've called home for the past 20 years. I'm grateful to be able to share space with all of you in this circle and to discuss these important issues and divides, and to be able to share with you a little bit about ISB. But I think I wasn't sure whether I was going to do this, but I am for sure. I'd like to give, especially the representatives from the banks, a little bit of context. So if you just bear with me. On December 26, 2004, our world witnessed the deadliest tsunami in our history. Over 200,000 souls from 11 countries stretching from Africa to Thailand lost their lives that day. And millions more would be forever changed. But of all of those impacted by this devastation, there was one community that was left virtually unscathed. These people knew the tsunami was coming. Long before any of the weather stations or Western technology could even pick up that there was a problem, they knew, and they knew what to do about it. You see, these people's culture and their remarkable lens on life have been preparing them for generations. And because of that, all of them survived, even though they actually live right there on the ocean. These phenomenal beings are the Indigenous people known as the Samabajo. There are 370 million Indigenous people in over 70 countries around the world that share a similar Indigenous lens to that of the Samabajo. And along with it, generations and generations of knowledge, expertise, and solutions that have been nearly non-accessible until now. My company ISB was founded on the belief that by bringing together our Indigenous experts with the Western world in a way that is mutually respectful, in a way that we can see and hear each other, that we could create a world of unlimited possibilities. Possibilities that would impact our generations and generations to come, possibilities that could amend a history, and possibilities that would definitely change the way we do things and the way we see things, and for sure save a lot of lives. With that, I want to tell you that ISB is the first and only international Indigenous Speakers Bureau in the world, in a global multi-billion-dollar industry, which is pretty ironic considering Indigenous people are known for their oral knowledge sharing. Why is that? Why are we the only one? When there's so much to learn and gain from Indigenous worldview, why is that? Well, my experience and what I believe is that because we keep expecting Indigenous wisdom, worldview, and solutions to come through a Western model. And I just want to touch upon a couple of things, examples of what I mean by that. First thing, for those that aren't aware, Indigenous people are relational, not transactional. And what that means, it doesn't mean that there's not a transaction that takes place. It means about what our focus, our primary focus is on. It's about the relationship first. Much as my sister and panelist Tira had alluded to, relation is number one. And one of the things that Indigenous people will tell you and show you is that relations last longer than transactions. So how you handle those relations is super important. From a context of ISB, what does that mean to me as how do I run my business as an Indigenous model? Every phone call that comes in, I don't look at it as, okay, I'm going to make a gig. It's, going to make a sale, last thing on my mind. My first thing that I'm looking at is, who are these people? Where do they come from? How are they? Where are they as individuals and organizations? Have they ever met an Indigenous person? Have they ever had any engagement with Indigenous people? Are they here to learn, or are they here to check a box? And if they're here to check a box, what can I do to help them to go beyond that so that their generations and my generations can benefit from this relationship? Relationship, like I said, relational is really the number one key when it comes to Indigenous people. So if you don't incorporate that in your business, then that's one key divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous world. And I'll give you one example that my bank, just as of late, Affinity Credit Union, during this wonderful pandemic, and I say that with sarcasm, really approached me in a way that I appreciated, and it was relational. And it was when the pandemic hit, so many things were up in the air. Nobody knew what was going on and how things were going to go. And as a business person with a loan, when the entire speaking industry crashed because there was not going to be any gatherings for the next couple of years, we knew for sure a year, but likely 2 years, where was the revenue source going to come from? So how was I going to pay my loans? As I'm worrying about it, I didn't have to call my bank. My bank called me. They called me to find out how I was doing almost immediately. And they asked me, what can we do to help? And I really wasn't even sure. And without me even asking, they said, you know what? We're just going to defer. We're going to defer your loan for the next 6 months. And then let's have a conversation after that. I can't even tell you the fact that I didn't have to, like Tira said, and dignify myself and beg and plead, but they called me. And they said, what can we do? We know that you're important. We want you to carry on. What can we do? That was hugely important. The other thing that I want to kind of mention, and I can go on and on about relational because it's really a key component with Indigenous people. It's a different way of looking at things, and it's a different approach into doing things. The other thing that I feel is really key for the Western world to know is that Indigenous people think on different timelines than the Western world. When we look at things, when we're planning things, when we're looking at what we're going to create and what we're doing, inherently we're always thinking 7 generations. We're thinking 7 generations ahead of us and 7 generations behind us. How is what we're going to do today going to honor the shoulders that we stand on, the ancestors before us? How is what we're doing going to impact our future generations that are coming? That every step that we take. And what's interesting, and I always say this to businesses, when you start planning instead of in quarterly, annually, and 5-year reports, when you stop looking from that Western model and you start looking at 150 years from now and in respects to 150 years before, the questions that you ask and the solutions you come up with, completely different. And so when you look at an Indigenous person, they're not just looking at themselves in that particular moment and that what their business is doing right there. They're looking forward and back all the time inherently in what they're doing. And so when you're in relation with them and you're trying to figure out how are we going to go forward, maybe try to step into that worldview about how far ahead and how you're going to be impacting. And what does that mean as a business? Well, for me as the only Indigenous speakers bureau in the world, there's no way in the world that I could ever approach speaking industry the same way as the rest of the world does. And that's why there is no other Indigenous model right now. And I couldn't make it about transaction, of course. I had to make it about relationship, not only just with the clients that we work with, but also with my speakers. We're family. We look at each other and we treat each other as family. And much like Tira and Sunshine said, we look, how do we help each other? How can we help each other? Where can we partner? That's relational. That's the way we look at things. And so simple things to some, but really complex in an Indigenous world, payment for a speaker. I had to look at how currently they were being treated in the world. And quite often when an Indigenous person goes to speak, I mean, there's this big disconnect about how do you pay and how much do you pay an Indigenous person. But besides that, when it came to payment, their payments were 30, 60, 90, sometimes 180 days, or if ever, down the road. When you come from a demographic where there's no generational wealth to pass on, and that they're literally trying to feed their families off what they make today, you can't make them wait that long. And so I made a commitment to make sure that they went home with their payment on the day of. No financing, no whatever, that they got paid on the day. And on top of that, because I want to honor the ancestral knowledge that they're bringing forward, I'm taking it a step further. 10 days before their engagement, they get an advance on what they're gonna do, because I don't want them worrying about whether they're gonna have their payment. They're getting it, and they're also being honored. So it's about going that extra. I say, stop thinking outside the box and start thinking for what's good for the circle. That'll change a lot of things. So I think I'll stop there. There's just one thing that I want to say about Affinity, where they helped us with regards to the payments with our speakers. I actually went and interviewed all the big six when I first started this business. And it's taken me 6 years to get to where I am now, but it's not something that I could transactionally speed track. I had to be able to do this slowly and then do it right. And when I interviewed them, one of the biggest problems that I had is, in order for me to give my speakers 2 payments per engagement, and with our projections, I had to look at how do I do this quickly and easily. And when I talked with all the banks, I mean, wire transfer, we couldn't look at e-transfer because there's a limit of $25,000 a month. Well, that could be 1 gig for us. So I had to look at, how do I make this happen? Because I don't want them waiting. And that's 2 transactions. And the bank's telling me, well, each transaction is going to cost you at least $35. They would have killed us in fees. They would have totally killed us. And much to our surprise, at the tail end of our interviewing of the different banks, we thought, well, let's just try the credit union. Let's try Affinity Credit Union. And they blew us out of the water. They not only introduced us to the CAF system and that they walked us right through. They took us right through it. They made sure we understood. They gave us a representative to help us along the way. So again, that relational experience is super, super, super important. So thank you. Hi.
Miigwech, Shannon, thank you so much for joining us today, and as well being courageous and stepping up and sharing. I'll now pass the floor over to my colleague, Shannon Pestun, who's the Senior Advisor of Business and Finance at WEKH. She's going to be moderating a panel with our guests today, our event partner, Monica James, Manager of Indigenous Banking East at BDC, Tracy Antoine, Vice President, Indigenous Markets BC Region with RBC, Jeff McAulay, Vice President, Indigenous Banking at BMO, and Jaimie Lickers, Vice President of Indigenous Banking with Cibc.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Ashley. And I just wanted to say that today I acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Ccab, the Piikani, and the Kainai. I also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes here in the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta. I'm so delighted to be here, a former business banker myself, a proud Cree Métis woman from Calgary now is where I call home. But looking forward to diving into this conversation. I'd like to welcome the panelists, and I'd like each of you just to take a moment just to introduce yourselves and some of the work that you're doing to advance women's entrepreneurship, Indigenous women's entrepreneurship across the country. Monica, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you very much to everybody that shared. I think this conversation is so important. And you know what, as bankers, we hear you. We know there's lots that needs to be changed in the banking system. We hear you. We are big ships that take a long time to turn, but please realize that we are allies of yours. By all of us being Indigenous, we haven't walked in your shoes as an entrepreneur, but as being a proud Cree woman from the Peter Valentine Cree Nation, I fight for you. So the changes that we are making in the banking system, it is for you. So please understand that we hear you. What are we doing for Indigenous women entrepreneurs? Well, you know, when we talk about the loans, we have a loan called the Indigenous Entrepreneur Loan. So there's a preferred rate. We totally understand. You know, we don't want to be giving you high rates. So with that, we have no application fees because you don't need to be paying more fees. There's no annual management fees. And the really important thing is actually on the anniversary date, if your loan's been in good standing, a certain percentage of your outstanding loan balance is paid out to any Canadian registered charity of your choice. So we have been helping registered charities all across the country for many, many years. Giving and sharing with our people we understand is important to the community and giving back. And so that's why BDC does that. We hear you. We are connected. That's part of our job as well as being Indigenous in the banking system, because it is tough navigating the financial markets, what's going on, where do you actually go for money. So part of our job is connecting you with a grassroots organization, so the Aboriginal financial institutions. It's connecting you with other Indigenous women entrepreneurs, because that is what I think is going to build power and help people move forward. We also do free financial literacy training. So we've trained over 200 Indigenous entrepreneurs from coast to coast to coast. We partner with a number of First Nations, Aboriginal financial institutions. As of late, we've partnered with Can-Do. It's about getting that information out there to our people so that they can be educated when it comes to running your business. I think the most important asset that you can actually have is financial knowledge. Because if you don't have that, it is a very scary area to try and be navigating. But please reach out to any of us. We are here to help and we are your ally.
Thank you, Monica. Jaimie, I'll ask you.
Thanks so much, Shannon. And I'll echo Monica's comments. Thank you all for sharing your stories. I think it's really important for us to hear what you face on the ground and what it looks like to be on the other side of a banking relationship. So I really value all of your contributions. A little bit about myself. I'm Haudenosaunee. I'm an Onondaga woman from the Six Nations of the Grand River community here in Southern Ontario. I'm very new to the banking industry. I was a lawyer up until October of 2020, and then I was somehow convinced to come join the banking world. So I'm probably newer to banking than most of our other panelists, but happy to be over at CIBC doing some really important work to advance our service offerings for all Indigenous people across the country, entrepreneurs, nations, economic development corporations. And like Monica at BDC, we're working really hard through a lot of partnerships to address what I think are some systemic barriers that face our Indigenous clients generally. Partnerships with organizations like Can-Do and AFOA, also with the Ccab, which I'll talk a little bit more about because it responds directly to one of our later questions. But also I think part of what CIBC is doing as an institution is the reason that I am at CIBC, and that is creating a dedicated national team of specialist bankers who service only Indigenous clients. There's specialized knowledge that our team has, which makes servicing our Indigenous clients less painful, I hope, than it was in the past when you were dealing with a banker who maybe didn't understand the nuances in the Indigenous market. And part of my job at the bank is to make that an even less painful process for folks like you who are trying to start businesses. So I will leave it at that because I know we're going to get into more of this as we go through the questions.
Jaimie, thank you so much. And Tracy, I will throw it over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the role that you're doing over at RBC to advance Indigenous women's entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Shannon. WEKH, Tracy, Antoine, and Squex, Testactaus, Skichistan, and Antoine, Nashawa Molo. Hello, my name is Tracy Antoine. My parents are from Bonaparte and Skichistan, located in the Shawatman territory in the central interior of BC. I'm honored to be here today representing RBC as the Vice President of Indigenous Markets. As Jaimie had just mentioned, the banks are working very hard at learning and training within the banking industry as a whole, which is a very large task to take on for learning and opening doors of opportunity for jobs. So we actively recruit for Indigenous peoples to come into the big banks so that they can learn the banking industry in order to be able to give back and help those, whether it's a community member or a small business or a commercial sized business or a capital market based business. So businesses are banked in tiers. So when you become a banker, and I've been with RBC now for 15 years, I started out 5 years in retail, started as a teller into branch management so that I could manage people. And then for 7 years, I was a commercial account manager. For 2 years, I worked in Toronto, writing and refreshing Indigenous market policy for unreserved lending for housing, co-writing that policy, as well as consolidating and simplifying the commercial policy. So there's so many tiers and so many avenues and access to capital, but when Indigenous peoples struggle or find those barriers are there, we can start everyday discussions with your relationship with your business account manager, building out, which is what I've been hearing from everybody so far this morning. It's relationship and location. So with those two barriers, we're working hard as FIs to break those barriers down by recruiting more Indigenous peoples in, training them up. We even have created a 2-year rotational program where they can come in and go back out to community. They're not intended to stay within the big bank. We understand that there's a gap. And in the role that I have as VP in the BC region, very committed to bridging that gap because there's continues to be sessions like this where I hear the same thing: financial literacy, help us bridge the gap, help us get access to capital, and help us understand how. So thank you. Like in 15 years with RBC, I've learned a lot, and I'm still learning a lot. And as a lifelong learner and an MBA, and looking to do a doctorate soon in business administration because of the banking industry and this gap, I believe that there's a lot that we can all do.
Tracy, thank you so much. And Jeff, I'll give the last introduction to you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, ladies, for kicking us off with the introductions. I'm proud and honored to be on this panel with all of you here today. So I thank you for that. My name is Jeff McAulay. I'm the Vice President of Indigenous Banking for BMO, and I'm proud and honored to work within an organization that has had a dedicated Indigenous banking unit for almost 30 years. So when we think about the impact that we've been able to have across those 30 years in Canada, I know Jaimie mentioned before about looking at a national approach. That's something we've had, and we have specialists across Canada that deal only with Indigenous clients. So the relationship piece around providing the relationship with our clients is that we're able to be that one-stop holistic individual who can speak to nations and individuals about all of their banking needs. So regardless if it is an entrepreneur, whether it is the nation itself, whether it's an investment opportunity, whether it's a trust settlement, whether it's a commercial development, a green energy project, all of those conversations happen with the individual who is responsible for each of those areas. So we were founded in '92, as I mentioned before, by Ron Jamieson, a Mohawk from the Six Nations and a recipient of the Order of Canada. And today we're proud and honored to be guided by our Indigenous Advisory Council, which consists of leadership from coast to coast of Indigenous gentlemen and ladies, and Métis as well, Inuit as well, pardon me. I'm just happy to be here today. I know Tracy mentioned about the lifelong journey. I've already learned a number of things and written a number of things down. So I'm hoping that I can contribute a little bit, but I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to learn as well.
Jeff, no doubt you will contribute much. And so thank you to all of our panelists for the introduction. Ashley, thanks for, convening everyone today, because this is an important conversation to have. And I think my goal here today as the moderator is to take some of those learnings that we're getting from you, from the Indigenous women entrepreneurs, that you've provided your feedback to us, and also having to bridge now these comments to the financial institutions and giving them an opportunity as well to share back. These conversations are so critically important as we journey on our path towards economic reconciliation. And so thank you to all for your courage to share your stories, and as well I'll say to the financial institutions as well, for being good listeners, because it is only through listening that we're going to see where these barriers are, how they intersect, and how they prevent Indigenous women entrepreneurs from starting or growing their companies. So thank you for allowing us to have what sometimes can feel like an awkward and if not a heavy conversation. In the spirit of just going into, we've got the big financial institutions here, I want to hone in on the fact that there are multiple different types of financing. So there are equity financing solutions, and then there's debt financing. And I want to be really clear that who we have at the table today, we're really talking about debt financing. Tara, I heard you mention earlier venture capital and angel capital. I want to really speak to, Monica, I'm going to ask you to speak to this on behalf of BDC, but help me understand, or help us all understand, what is debt financing and what sort of products would fall under the category of debt financing?
You knew at least one person was going to do that. So essentially, the easiest definition for debt financing is when you go and get a loan from a creditor and you need to repay it over a certain period of time, and you have to pay a premium for that. So that's going to be your interest rate. Inside of debt financing, you really need to look at it as your business on a continuum. Are you a lifestyle entrepreneur, or are you an aviation company? Where are you actually on there? And in that, depending upon your business needs, there are different types of debt financing. So there's microfinancing, there is fintech, there are development bankers. So you're going to have, the Aboriginal financial institutions in there, and you're also going to have the credit unions. You're going to have the chartered banks. So every type of debt financing can service your business depending upon what your actual need is. And not all charter banks are going to be able to help all entrepreneurs. Not all micro can actually help all entrepreneurs either. So it needs to go back and forth. That's what I was saying initially, is that navigating the financial ecosystem in the Indigenous market is very, very challenging. So please come to us. As we said, we are all connectors. We're here to help you and make sure you are going on the right path and helping you navigate this financial market.
Thank you, Monica, and to the rest of the bankers on the panel too. When I think about debt financing, I think credit cards, I think operating lines to help with working capital, and I think about term debt, which helps with more of the purchase of more capital assets to help buy businesses. Any of the other bankers want to comment on what else falls under debt, just so that we know who we're speaking to today and what products you're actually offering? Okay.
Shannon, Tracy.
Oh, Jeff, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you could also include leasing in that as well, and if there's any vendor takebacks as well. So those are sometimes less traditional forms of lending when you're thinking about an entrepreneur, but they definitely would have to be included as well.
Thank you, Jeff.
Hi, Shannon. Tracy here.
Hi, Tracy.
When you think of debt lending and you think of small business and the financial state of the business owner, when you're talking about small business, the small business will grow as the personal status of the business owner grows. So when we have a look at lending, we also have a look at it being a dual relationship with the personal lending products as well. So we've been able to create a space for small business owners, Indigenous women entrepreneurs specifically as well, to have equity built into their homes, and that are in like 99-year lease on reserve, urban reserves environments, where that equity can then be injected into the small business for that continued growth. So when you look at a small business and its growth, and it's from inception at startup to its growth goals, whether it's to be just self-sustaining as a family or to go global or otherwise, national and then global, that personal financial state of literacy and borrowing has to move parallel with the business. It's not going to be successful without that pairing.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm going to stay on you for a moment, and I'm going to bring up what we as bankers know as the 5 C's of credit. And I think this is where sometimes we don't do a great job as an industry at helping our audience or our entrepreneurs know what are bankers looking at. So when we say the 5 C's of credit, can you break that down for me and help our audience here understand what are bankers looking for when they're assessing a loan?
So the standard banking procedure when you go in for personal credit, and I'm going to stick to personal credit a little bit, just based on the fact that without personal financial literacy and personal credit management, the 5 C's will apply to personal and business. So you can kind of run them parallel. But character, character, capacity, condition, capital, and collateral. So character provides reports that show the amount of debt that the person or the company is currently carrying, as well as their payment history. So we'll pull reports from commonly Equifax and TransUnion from the credit bureau to get that rating. It's not something that's assessed internally. It's something that we outsource as the rest of Canada. Capacity is the company's ability to pay their debt. When assessing the financial position of a borrower, FIs often use debt to income ratio as a measure of their ability and willingness to pay. So you look for things such as contract revenues, online sourced revenues for the social media. Nowadays, we have a lot of e-transfers coming into a business that's kind of expanded from just a local regional area to national exposure because of social media and its reach, or resulting from such programs like Powwow Pitch. Condition refers to the specifics of the project you are going to work together on. So whether you have together, you always have to have that family support, and then you also have to have an advisory relationship with bankers, insurance, accountants, legal counsel if you're going to go a little bit further than just the small local region for banking activities. 4 is capital. Capital refers to the cash your customer has available for paying their bills. So we look at the health and wealth of the bank accounts and also the ability to use your personal state of affairs to support the business and its growth. You're always going to be up against the growth and level of growth because you have a startup company to gain 2 years of strong startup financials, as Tara had mentioned earlier. But you're always up against the growth challenge, and that all comes back down to being able to manage your personal financial statement. Collateral is assets that can be used to secure funding for a project. So that I'm hearing there's a lot of concern about on-reserve collateral. Unfortunately, we're still living in the time of colonization where the Indian Act is still there and alive and well, and we have to, as FIs, work very diligently on access to capital, whether it be through, access to the bank accounts or any hard collateral security located on reserve. So that is tricky to get around, and you can't do it without legal advice. That is something that is a cost that gets transferred down to the client. But if you have other forms or ways of creating collateral that is located off reserve that is easily accessed by the bank in many other situations, then it removes that ability to access capital. So there's some banking solutions that are quite simple and generic that can be shared out, but I mean, then you start getting into the weeds of the actual financial literacy section of what all of the banks will provide any community at any time free of charge if they're just invited in.
Thank you, Tracy. And Shannon's asking if we can list the 5 C's there in the chat. And absolutely we can. And I think it's important to talk about the 5 C's because really with banking, it's about a shared relationship with risk. The bank sharing part of the risk with the entrepreneur. And that's what it's about. The 5 C's of credit are giving the financial institutions sort of a measurement or I guess a rule, if you will, that helps us understand what the risk looks like to that borrower. I think it's also important to note that all the 5 C's don't always have to be perfectly met. And it's always about sort of negotiating to say, so if I don't have collateral, is something else elevating my success or my opportunity to get a loan? And I think it's just opening up that dialogue, and for the financial institutions and our lenders to start asking different questions and educating too, I will say, women entrepreneurs on what banks are actually looking for. So Tracy, thank you. I think that was a really helpful overview. Jeff, I'm going to start with you on this next question, but over the past few years, and as we heard today on this call, there has been a greater call to build a more inclusive financial system. And how are mainstream financial institutions answering that call to break down some of the barriers that Indigenous women face along the entrepreneurial journey? And are you seeing or doing any new emerging banking products that are changing the landscape for Indigenous women? And Jeff, over to you.
Thank you very much. A great question. And I guess I'd just like to kick it off by saying, when we talk about some of the challenges that are out there, facing women, Indigenous entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs in general, the one great thing and the one difference that differentiates ourselves from from some of the other lenders that are in the market space right now is we truly are a bottom-up organization. So if you think about policy, procedures, governance, lending models, things that all the banks use, our policies are driven from the bottom up. So when I mentioned before, the gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen who work coast to coast as specialists within Bank of Montreal, the policies are driven by what they're seeing in the fields and what they're seeing with their customers and experiencing each and every single day. So it's a great approach, and it's a unique approach, but it's one that's really provided some value and actually driven some significant change right to the grassroots level. So I just wanted to make that quick comment. But when we talk about the banks making a move towards a more inclusive financial system, I would be remiss if I didn't mention BMO's involvement with SheEO, which we made a significant investment in a partnership with them in March of 2021. So when I think about the ways that financial institutions can help and make a significant difference, I look at something like SheEO as a non-traditional partnership. So something you wouldn't typically see as a partner between a financial institution and a not-for-profit organization. But we all know that SheEO is, their intention and their guidance is really to provide that hand up in terms of those opportunities for the ventures, the women-led ventures. And the investment that we were able to make with them is going to allow twice as many ventures to be able to get funding as they move forward. And the part that really struck me as an impact and how that really would relate to our conversation today is, almost 20% of those individuals who achieved funding from SheEO were, Indigenous entrepreneurs. So to me, that just speaks of an actual tangible benefit or a tangible non-traditional partnership that we're seeing that really is going to provide some significant benefits kind of going forward. So that partnership is unique, and it is something that I'm proud to be a part of, and our organization to be part of. When I think about other opportunities and all other social impacts, is what some other folks have talked about here today. I think about we've also talked a little bit about the procurement challenges with procurement, and I would also, be remiss to think about, when when COVID hit and the impact of PPE and how disproportionately, First Nation communities and individuals were impacted. I look at a partnership that we had with a company called Inish Branding, who we were able to purchase, PPE from to be able to distribute within our organization. So I'm actually proud to work with an organization that has a procurement division that specifically looks at how to increase the partnerships with Indigenous entrepreneurs. So when we look at or think about the path that an entrepreneur would be on, we're going to talk a lot today about financing. We're going to talk a lot today about access to capital. But I think there's also an important piece of what happens when the entrepreneur gets going and they hit the ground running. How can we build that ecosystem around them to support them as that business develops going forward? And I think procurement is definitely one of those things that we can look at for sure. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Jaimie, I will throw it over to you, please.
Thanks, Shannon. I keep getting the message that my internet is unstable, which is perhaps a reflection of my mental state over a year into COVID and working from home, but I hope you guys can hear me okay. So one of the things that I wanted to take a minute to talk about was the importance of CIBC's partnership with CCAB, the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, which I think is doing wonderful things in the Indigenous business space generally, but particularly when it comes to supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs, men and women. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the organization, I would really encourage you to get familiar, to just poke around their website. They have tons of tools and programs that are really aimed at facilitating the growth of Indigenous businesses and really strengthening partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses, including a really great program called the TFAB program, which provides tools and training and networking connections to help Indigenous entrepreneurs grow their businesses. And then including connecting those business people with financing options. But the CCAB also specifically has an Indigenous Women Entrepreneurship Fund, which is a micro financing program for Indigenous women-owned businesses, which was actually established from a donation from CIBC, which is part of why I wanted to talk to you about it, because I think it's a great program. And when we talk about just needing that little bit of seed capital to start a business, it's a great opportunity to get that first capital that you're going to need just to get off the ground. And then what the CCAB does with that program is they offer those loans for up to 3 years at 0% interest rates. And then that business also becomes connected through CCAB's Aboriginal Procurement Marketplace, which is then going to help the business make connections that are going to increase the likelihood of success for the business as it grows and develops. So we're really proud of that partnership and really proud of the work that we do with the CCAB. And I just wanted to share that with those of you who might not know about what they're doing over at CCAB.
Thank you, Jaimie. Tracy, how about RBC?
RBC has recently been involved with the Lift Circle, which embodies now more than ever the we concept, not the me concept. This incredible collective is empowering female entrepreneurs to challenge the status quo of business through the creation of a united front. And we at RBC could not be more proud of supporting a group of such impactful individuals where we need support, and we know that they are the grassroots within their communities. A lot of the matriarchs without even knowing that they're matriarchs, because in essence, that's what it's defined by. It's a humbling experience and a really powerful place to be when you see women across the country gather to uplift and support each other and help overcome the barriers that they are facing today.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And Monica, I'll throw it over to you for the last word on this question.
Yeah, you betcha. So since 2014, BDC has had a strategy specifically to support women entrepreneurs. Our Indigenous banking unit has been around since the early 90s. Starting on April 1st, those two departments are actually going to become married. So when we talk about how are we supporting Indigenous women entrepreneur, we realize that having a client diversity team that's saying, you know what, BDC, we need to be more on point. We need to make sure that we're helping these women entrepreneurs. You know, we help them with training, being connector, help them connecting them with financing and other options that are out there. We also have supplier diversity. Somebody started on that. I'm going to, in the chat box, please, everybody register. You know, we give priority to women, diverse groups, Indigenous, visible minorities. Please register your business because we have a lot of opportunity to support you as entrepreneurs. But as of late, so tomorrow, you guys are getting privy to this information, but tomorrow there's going to be a press release. So that some of you may have heard of the Indigenous Growth Fund. So it's a new and innovative fund. It's agreement between NACA and a number of funding organizations. So the federal government and BDC are jointly putting in $100 million along with two other organizations. The announcement's going to be coming out tomorrow. I don't want to steal anybody's thunder there, so I'm not sure who they are or how much. And essentially the whole point of this is I've been in banking since 2018. And one thing that's common, two things, lack of access to capital and procurement, right? I think everybody's in agreement with me. We don't have enough funding out there to help entrepreneurs, and why do we have all these things with procurement if we're not giving priority and helping them? So in regards to this, so the whole point of the Indigenous Growth Fund is to actually put more capital in the hands of the organizations that are at the grassroots and have an exceptional connection to our Indigenous entrepreneurs, and that's the Aboriginal financial institutions. So that is actually going to be starting April 1st in a couple of days. And so I think that is so important to be able to get that money into the grassroots organizations that are going to be able to help our Indigenous entrepreneurs.
That's great news, Monica, and congratulations to the team. Looking forward to hearing more about that announcement then tomorrow. Monica, I'm going to leave it. I'm just going to stay with you for 1 second because I want to talk about how important it is for financial institutions to have internal folks like yourself that are really being the advocates internally for Indigenous women entrepreneurs. What role do you play as an advocate at BDC?
So like I said before, our Indigenous banking unit has been around since since the early 90s. It's had many transformations. So in 2014, the bank said, you know what, the Indigenous banking unit, you guys are the best ones to get connected with the market. We're going to make you into a business center. So essentially your job is to go out there and get loans. So in 2014, we started with 300 Indigenous entrepreneurs at BDC. Right now we're at 900. So in terms of the job that they wanted us to do, we did it very well. The problem is it's just not scalable. We've essentially hit a glass ceiling because in order to connect with the market, we need like-minded and like-bodied individuals. So we need, Indigenous people in banking, which let me tell you, it is very, very hard to find somebody that can hit both of those, tick both of those boxes, because we want somebody to be like-minded, to actually understand, and like-bodied, kind of walk the walk. And so what happened is we're seeing at BDC, so when we talk about financing the Indigenous market, it's in a 3-tier system. So the first tier is lending directly to First Nations, which BDC cannot do because it's considered like, a government, and we can't lend to them. The second tier is lending directly to First Nations Economic Development Corporations. We do some work. And the third tier, the most important tier, is lending directly to Indigenous entrepreneurs. So about 90% of the deals that we do are directly to Indigenous entrepreneurs. We're pretty small when we talk about the Indigenous financial ecosystem. Our asset base in this market for Indigenous is only 400 million. And, with the people that are on the panel, they're probably sitting at about $2.5 billion because they look at, they're able to do things that BDC can't. And so what we said is that in order to be more impactful is instead of our Indigenous strategies sitting on the shoulders of 9 Indigenous account managers across the country, we no longer have the Indigenous banking unit starting April 1. And we've made it the bank's responsibility in terms of increasing our reach and visibility. So what's happening is the bank actually, we put in our corporate plan saying, you know what, by next year, we need to have this many Indigenous entrepreneurs. And so what we're doing is we're taking that target and we're saying, okay, each area, you're now responsible for this. So as we all know, whatever gets measured gets done. So let me tell you, you're going to be seeing a lot more of BDC in terms of supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs. And the reason why is just because we have more people here. We've also created a champion model. So obviously we don't have a lot of people at BDC that are Indigenous, but we have a lot of like-minded people so that people understand, the different realities of the market, and just saying, you know what, I see that this is, an underserviced market, and I want to be helping. So they're probably not Indigenous, but they definitely want to be helping. So we've moved to a champion model, and now it's going to be the responsibility of everybody at BDC instead of it sitting on the shoulders of 9 people.
Well, talk about changing a scorecard. We've got time for, I'm hoping we have time for one last question. Ashley, I'll just kind of maybe let you talk to me in the chat here if we're running out of time, because I know we're almost at time, but I think this last question is really probably the most important. And I want to talk about, we've all said that more needs to be done. And from our panelists today, I really want to ask each of you, from your perspective, what are the 2 to 3 things the banking sector needs to prioritize to continue to grow Indigenous women's entrepreneurship? And Jaimie, if I can, I will start this question with you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because obviously there is a long way to go. The biggest thing in my mind is just continuing to identify and address the systemic barriers, which which are not barriers that were erected with the intention of limiting access to financing for any particular group. These are just policies that have developed over time that make sense in a certain context, that don't work when you're trying to work with an Indigenous entrepreneur, whether that's a man or a woman. Tracy mentioned that we're still operating under a colonial system where the Indian Act still applies. And that's, aside from engaging in lobbying efforts, that's not something that the major financial institutions can change. All we can do is try to find innovative ways to get around some of these barriers that exist as a result of the legal and regulatory regime. They're not even necessarily barriers that were themselves created by policies of financial institutions. So the more Indigenous people that we can recruit into our ranks in the banking and finance world generally, across every job, across every type of institution, the more knowledge we will bring into institutions to be able to address some of these issues. And even though I'm not a banker by trade, I mean, I will be at some point, I suppose, but I came to CIBC as a lawyer, and I came as someone who was very familiar with the Indian Act, with the restrictions under the Indian Act, with how the legal regime for holding land and assets works. And I'm able to look at certain banking documents, whether it's application forms or policies, and I can say, look, I understand why this requirement is here, but it's not going to work for our Indigenous clients, and here's why, and here's what we could do to still meet our requirements, because I understand why you're asking for this information or where you're trying to get, but we have to find a different way to get there for our Indigenous clients. And that is only going to come from either Indigenous people infiltrating the system or those allies that we talk about. My whole team is not Indigenous at CIBC, and I don't think it needs to be. We have some really enlightened allies that have been working in this space for a lot longer than I have, and they're just as valuable to us as our Indigenous people. So more Indigenous people, more sharing of knowledge and addressing these barriers head on, some lobbying efforts on those barriers that come from the imposition of outside regulations or laws, I think is necessary. And then I think we just need to do more education institution-wide, even for the folks who are not directly client-facing with Indigenous clients on a day-to-day basis. We just need to grow our knowledge as an institution.
Thank you, Jaimie. Jeff.
Yeah, that's Jaimie pretty much stole almost all of my thunder. I think we're all in the same boat in terms of I mean, all organizations are probably very similar in our path and our journey moving forward. I will touch on one thing. We talk about financial capital, economic capital, and social capital. I think that for me, the most important aspect of it is actually the social capital piece, because we're all moving forward and pushing forward on the access to capital. We're all moving forward on access to funding, making it easier for people to lend money, understanding the restrictions that exist and how to work within them. But I really think for women, Indigenous entrepreneurs, I think that the social capital piece is really important, and I'll tell you why. One around the education. Jaimie just spoke about the education piece, and it's not only an education amongst us who work in it every single day, but it just within our organizations. I think it more needs to be done from an education piece. And then the flip side of that too is that, use the old saying, if you give a person a fish, they'll eat for a day, but if you teach a person to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. And I think as financial institutions, it is our responsibility to share the knowledge that we know. And, you can give people money and you can approve business plans and you can show them all of these great things, but if you can't teach them how to be successful, then they're not going to be successful. So that time investment to me speaks louder than any type of conversation that can be had, is those one-on-one conversations with the actual entrepreneurs themselves, to show them how to work within the system and what they would need to do to be successful. and partnerships. We talked about partnerships and expanding partnerships. Jaimie mentioned the partnership with the CCAB. BMO's proud to be a 6-time PAR gold PAR recipient. So that's a huge shingle that we're proud of. But BMO is also proud to partner with WEKH. We're partnering with putting on workshops, working with I can't spill the beans, as Monica was talking about today earlier, but we'll be partnering with a major academic in Canada to move a program forward for women Indigenous entrepreneurs. So stay tuned, it's coming, but there's definitely more to be done. But I really think at the end of the day, knowledge is key.
Jeff, thank you. Looking forward. I love all these little teasers that are coming out. Monica, over to you.
I think the most important thing, Jaimie, Jeff, everybody, we're all in agreement, but really the important thing is just that we're listening, right? We're listening, we're getting your feedback, we're educating. Education internally, right? So the TRC calls to action. Another hat that I lead at BDC is I am the lead for our Indigenous group for diversity inclusion. So internally, how are we educating our workforce and changing our workplace so it is more diverse and inclusive? Just because we have Indigenous people working at BDC doesn't mean that we're diverse. Doesn't mean that we're inclusive. And those are very different things. So we're actually doing, all of our managers and up have done unconscious bias training. Everybody in the bank is going to be doing anti-racism training. And then also my group is going to be pushing to be pressing education on Indigenous peoples at school. There's a lot of things that are happening, systemic racism, the reason why, things are happening the way that they are, but we are, we are your allies. We are listening to you, and we're trying to make things happen. So please be patient. That's one thing I ask of everybody, and realizing that where we all fit into this financing ecosystem. But please keep speaking, please keep coming to us, because by getting information for you, the knowledge keepers, that is how we are actually going to change. So please keep sharing.
Thank you, Monica. I'm so glad you brought up the unconscious bias training. I think that's a really important point. Tracy, over to you for last word on this. What are the 2 to 3 things that you think the banking sector ought to do to help Indigenous women entrepreneurs advance in Canada?
So it's pretty easy for me to be able to say, Jaimie, Jeff, ditto on the training. We at RBC, we're working on that circular mindset of training by partnering with organizations that are in the academic world of building programs that are online, that are at various levels. We do have financial literacy. We do have an RBC call to action under the TRC call to action 92. We've committed to that since 2006, and we can, and prior to that, in there you'll see that we opened our first unreserved bank in 1910 right here in BC, northern BC. So we've always taken into the Indigenous market, and from the community member to the Business Development Corporation to the First Nations government very seriously. And that circular 4 seasons of reconciliation is what our internal program for all 86,000 employees across the country, because we're building up our allies as well. As Jaimie had indicated, our recruits don't have to be our teams don't have to be Indigenous in order for us to be effective. So we're building up that allyship across the country right now. We're also working on establishing more partnerships, more networks with Indigenous market specialists in legal, insurance, and others. And again, creating more allies, creating more advisors that we can bring to the table in forums such as this, or, we're happy to always present like RBC Future Launch, which creates personal well-being, financial literacy. In June, we have some really exciting announcements coming out around financial literacy for community members as well. There's a lot. We're in this pendulum of First Nations communities managing poverty to managing wealth, and those communities and the wealth that they're coming into, that wealth transfer is happening from government and industry over to the nation, over to the development corporation, over to the membership through per capita distributions, or however they seem to do it. They're also starting to ask, how can we help our entrepreneurs by guaranteeing their loans at the bank? So again, we have to stretch our minds and make this stuff happen, because it is the market that drives the activities at the big FIs. So I would encourage everybody that's you know, colleagues included, to make sure that we continue to stretch our minds and continue to work hard at that call to action 92 on the corporate challenge, and working with key partners like NACA and Ccab and the community futures that are under the Western Economic Diversification pillar for funding, to get these startup businesses kicked off and going. And then the banks can definitely step in and manage and help financially build that financial literacy as a business owner, so that your growth in the actual business itself can, again, parallel and move forward. RBC has been on the boots on the ground Indigenous commercial account managers. My team of 7 + 2 trainees, we're giving them a year to learn what's happening in BC, because there's so much activity. The more people learning, the more allies we create, the stronger we will all be together.
Thank you. And to each of the panelists, and I just want to sum up my thoughts today, but when I think about the barriers that Ashley talked about earlier, you know, we see for Indigenous women entrepreneurs, we see access to financial capital, social capital, entrepreneurial capital, and cultural sensitivities that come into play for Indigenous women. And today I'm hearing we're looking at new products as an industry. We're finding innovative ways to get more capital into the hands of Indigenous women. I'm hearing more about education and financial literacy. I'm hearing more about growing networks and partnerships for Indigenous women, helping them get into supply chains. And I'm seeing a greater commitment to challenging unconscious bias and anti-racism campaigns internally. So I think the financial system is positioned to touch on each of these. And I applaud the great work that you're doing, the work that you're trying to still move forward, recognizing that we still have work to do. So I thank you, Ashley. I'm going to pass it over to you.
I'll just jump on. I know we're at time, so Chimigwech to all of our panelists and, you know, everyone who contributed today, all of our partners who helped make this happen. You know, I've spent literal hours planning this over the past couple months, and it's been, you know, just as much of a learning journey for me as I'm sure it has been for everyone here today. So I will send out the recording later today, along with, you know, some of the links and resources that were shared in the chat. And truly, I hope that this is just the beginning of many, many more discussions and partnerships to be built. I've felt the energy of everyone showing up today in a good way. So miigwech.
Cookstrom.